Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding. And today's discussion topic will be children. And there are people here who have children, and there are people here who don't have children. But I'm guessing everybody here has been a child, and I'm also guessing that most people, if not every single person here, has read a book with a child in it. All of those things count. So yeah, there we are. And so I don't know. I mean, I think one of the reasons why, okay, so the main reason why I picked this topic for this week was that I'm writing a novella right now where the protagonist has 5 children. And it's presenting some really unique challenges because the children range in age from 2 to 19. And so I'm having to take my time and think through, okay, event X happens. How does each child react to these events? And so it's gotten me thinking about basically, you know, the kinds of things, what children are capable of at different ages. And also about how often when we encounter kids in fiction, they're like child geniuses, right? and so, you know, the kids in my novella are not child geniuses, but at the same time, kids are often a lot smarter than some authors would give them credit for. So I think, yeah, so that's kind of why I wanted to jump in on this topic. We can talk about developmental stuff. We can talk about portrayal of kids in fiction. But let's start with not all children are child geniuses. And actually, I don't even know whether the child geniuses we've read about, thinking of a couple in particular, are actually at all like actual child geniuses. So it's hard to say.
The child genius is often, it's an identification thing. You're providing something for a child reader that they can go like, oh wow, I'm like this kid and this kid's a genius. I must be a genius too.
That's right. You know, what do they call that? Aspirational.
I was gonna say like wish fulfillment if you're like in reading children's books, like the God, what was that? Ewan Colfer.
Artemis Fowl.
Artemis Fowl, yeah, super genius.
On the other hand,
that's like wish fulfillment because he's super rich, he's super smart, and he has no parental oversight.
No parental oversight. Yeah,
that's actually a trope.
Too often.
How many
Manfred
orphans?
Manx comes to mind as well.
Who?
Manfred Manx. It's not Stephen Baxter. I don't remember who it is, but yeah, the sort of. I think he starts as genius teen and goes into genius adult, but yeah, it's the same sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I think we all like to think we're special. Actually, one of the kids that I always thought was really interesting was Percy Jackson, because he took the old. I mean, he took the whole dyslexia thing and turned it into like you have secret superpowers. I thought that was an interesting choice. And it was ADHD as well. So yeah.
But Harry Potter was relatively normal on the genius front. He had a special destiny, but he wasn't particularly great at anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Until you get Quidditch. So he's a jock.
Hold on. I think we have a fork where the Skiffy fork is genius child and the fantasy and magic fork is the destined child.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Good point, Kat.
So
Yes, smartness is not valued in fantasy worlds in the same way as it is in science fiction worlds, but magical talent or power is valued in fantasy worlds in a way that it's not in science fiction worlds.
Uh-huh. That's interesting.
I wonder how much of that comes out of sort of fairy tales where it's the stupid kid that always makes good. But it is. I mean, in
Well, yeah,
Grimm, there's-
there is a
Yeah.
definite thread of that. I can think of
Yep.
several examples that I'm not putting my finger on enough to really
So-
describe them.
right.
But like,
It's the key word for fantasy and fairy tales is simple, the simple child
yeah.
or the simpleton. So I think that there is something to be said for the fact that I can't think of very many science fictional equivalents to the simple child
mhm.
or to the simpleton saves everybody. I think that it's true. There's a certain intellectual snobbery in the world building that I can think of right now. Although I am writing a story with a child who's a child, but the child is not the protagonist.
Mhm.
I know that Marguerite has written a child who is very much a child. Again, not the protagonist. It is about defining the protagonist as a parent, or so there's interaction with the children. It's, I think, a question of who you tell the story from and why are you telling the story from the eyes of an ordinary child. Not that that would be a bad thing to do.
Right.
Mhm.
Because I mean, these are deliberate choices, and you want your protagonist to have tools to get through the story.
Right.
Right. And so the question then becomes, well, what are those tools and why are they important?
Well, and I think that anyone who actually gets a book written actually has a certain level of intellectual ability that's, I mean, you're writing children like yourself a little bit. I noticed a great many children are in stories they're often writers. It's, I mean, these are, or you'll have someone like The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley, where you have the main character. It's a fantasy universe, so magic is valued, but she has no magical ability until she grows up. So it kind of gives a child that kind of, well, even if I'm a misfit and a failure right now, someday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. I mean, I remember relating to the X-Men and going, what if I got powers when I became a teen? You know? I mean, yeah, obviously it wasn't portrayed as something that was uncomplicated, but at the same time, you could imagine doing all kinds of wacky, cool stuff.
Or you have someone like the Anne McCaffrey's ship novels, where the sentient ships, where the child was born was she was injured and became trapped in her body, and so she was given the body of a ship. The Ship Who Sang, I believe, is what it was called.
Yeah, the Ship Who Sang.
There are a number of stories in that vein. A number of brain brawn ships. It was a whole thing.
Alistair Reynolds uses it in a sense. The conjoiners, the engines of conjoiner ships are actually driven by exceptional minds.
Yeah. So, so one of the things, well, there are a couple of developmental things that I think are worth noting, right? I'm thinking about, oh shoot. I'm thinking about this novel that I read where, okay, I know the name of this, but I'm not thinking of it. It's the one with the Shrike.
The Hyperion series?
Yeah, Hyperion, there you go. So in Hyperion, there's this dad who has his daughter who is aging backwards, right?
Yes.
And he's carrying her around with him because by the time that she's in this story, she's very small. And he tends her occasionally. But I don't see him tending her in the way that I would expect somebody to tend a child of that age, which is basically constantly.
Yeah.
You know, now, of course, there are people who are forced to run around and have adventures with small children. You know, I was reading about a refugee family from Vietnam who came over when, the mom came over when she was 25 and her baby was 8 months old. And she ended up on a ship and they ran out of water. And you're wondering, oh my gosh, how did this baby stay alive? But she did. And that's the kind of thing where I would love to read that story in more detail. And, I think it would be fascinating. But you don't really see that a whole lot in fiction. And there are instances. I know, didn't Jay Lake write something about a mom who was traveling? Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, there's a lot of tending that goes into babies. It depends on the baby, obviously. So one of the things that I think is worth noting about children is children are not the same as each other. And they're vastly different. They come in all sorts of levels of ability and neurological configurations, and they come in all kinds of physical configurations, and there are definite complications that come with various types of things. And so always do your research, and not just on, medical stuff. But I think, like, go out there and read some mom diaries or something,
Yeah.
because there's so much variation in children. That said, it's worth noting that 6 months is right around when babies sit stably. In general, obviously these are grand generalizations, but 9 months is really important because at 9 months, that's typically when babies start to be able to read other people's faces. And it's a huge, huge difference in the way that the baby behaves. So that's worth making a note of. Babies generally start walking around 1 year old, but it can vary pretty widely. My son walked at 10 months. My daughter literally walked on her first birthday. But some kids don't walk until later, because if they're really expert crawlers, then they may think they don't need to worry about it. But my kids were never very good at crawling. And in fact, my son much preferred walking because his head was very large. And once he was down on the ground, he had a really hard time getting up again. So yeah, so he went from sitting to cruising to walking, and basically didn't learn to crawl until after he was already walking.
It just occurred to me that one of the reasons for expanding your ability to get around is to see what else is going on. And we didn't actually get around to cleaning off our flat surfaces until our kid was cruising. I was in another room. I was upstairs one day, and I hear this amazing crash, and I come downstairs, and my husband says, well, Elle just suddenly got up and started cruising and decided that the stuff did not belong on this table. But if you've already child-proofed and you can somehow see that there's nothing up there that you need to get at, I wonder if it's just less interesting to do the work of standing up and cruising.
I mean,
but that's a random thought. Research in child development, you'll see that it's give or take at least 3 months in terms of walking and talking, particularly. And those things are not necessarily indicative of academic success or
I'll say some kids are super curious and want to grab everything, and some are not. Some are super oral and some are not. I mean, I remember going to the beach one time when I was a kid, and there was this baby there, and this baby wanted to eat everything. I mean, I think I must have watched this kid ingest a pound of sand. I was like, what, 7 or 8? I was like horrified. God, he's eating sand.
Oh my God, I don't even.
Maybe it was like, this is really interesting to learn. I was like, holy cow.
Wow.
That's a good way to get sick too.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing.
Part bird.
Kids are always sick.
About having
Kids are always sick. Yeah.
that you deal with as a real person that I don't know you necessarily is approached in fiction is how strangers look at how you are raising your child. Because you know how many people are, you know, I've just heard, you know, right here kids are always sick, this is how these are horrifying things that a kid has just done. But and I thought, what was the mother doing? What were the parents doing while this was going on? So people will look at what you're doing with your child, whether it is, and they'll judge you.
Oh yeah.
Well, I didn't know they would chase laser pointers until a couple of months ago. So
Okay.
That is
I did not know that.
awesome.
I have never tried that on a child, only on cats. I will now, the next time I see a child, I am so red dotting that child.
I made an observation about
Please don't red dot strangers' children.
no.
Especially if you're a white man.
But here's
I
the
didn't
thing.
really mean it, honest.
I know, but I'm having a moment of racialized anxiety attack hearing that.
I understand.
There's an observation I made about 20 years ago is that up until about age 2, give or take, human children and puppies can be managed in very similar ways, can be taught in very similar ways. Because I was raising a very small child at the same time that my friend Dee, that Durana Durkin was raising her puppies. And it was just the similarity in the things that we were saying and the approaches that we were taking was astonishing to me.
I will make one observation that I think is potentially interesting for storytelling, and that is that kids learn the words that you use the most. And so if you don't want to hear no, then don't say it, right? Which, you know,
yes,
obviously, if you just decide on alternate ways of saying no to your child, because that's a necessary thing to do, then they will come back at you with exactly those alternate methods. But yeah.
Oh my God, no, Brian!
Are you frozen?
Everybody, no.
Oh my
Brian,
God, have you been on an airplane? I know
What's
you have,
going
and
on?
I know you have judged
okay.
other
Brian
people
says,
for their
is
kids
it only?
crying and kicking the back of your seat.
All right,
Yeah.
Brian says in chat, is it only parents who judge other parents?
no.
Not even close. Oh my
No,
God,
no.
not even close. People.
There is in fact a cliche: no kids, 7 theories; 7 kids, no theories.
Yep. And they don't even wait until the child is born to make judgments and pronouncements either.
I am so glad I have no knowledge of all of this.
oh my God, that was just. Yeah, but if you have one kid or 2 kids, you have 1 or 2 theories. It's, you know, when by the time you get to 7, you probably realize that I got no clue. I got 7 completely different human beings, and I don't know how that happened.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
how
so
they got to be so different, not how the. Yeah.
So I
think that's one of the.
Oh my God.
I want to hear what Kat has to say.
in talking about the not saying no to children thing, I wanted to add a little extra spin on that, in which when we don't give children enough space to say no, we end up raising children who don't know how to police their own boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And so with my children, we did a lot of talking about what their boundaries were and why I was going to overstep them and why other people shouldn't, and about who had which roles. And it makes me think a lot about Suzette Hayden Elgin's linguist series about
Yep.
having human children raised by aliens so that they would have a different perspective on culture and normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole idea that you should not ever say no to children ends up being misapplied in weird ways, which I have observed, because as a Californian, you get to see all sorts of exciting experimental child raising protocols.
Yeah.
And I do agree that children shouldn't just be barked at, and that while I agree that developmentally children and puppies have some things in common, using lots of long strings of words to puppies is not nearly as effective as using them to human children, where they actually learn to use them back at you.
Yeah, that's
That
true.
is true. They do, that's why up until about 2 years, similarities they're not identical, obviously. I think
I thank you for bringing up the point about no, Kat. And in fact, I did not mean to imply that kids should never be told no, just that the actual content of whatever this message, the boundary message is going to come back to you in the form that you use it. And therefore, if you don't like people yelling no at you, then you should not yell no at them.
It's appropriate use and an explanation of the boundaries and why you should be allowed to say no to your child, or why your child should be allowed to say no to you, because the number of times that I have found myself thinking, you spend all these years telling your child you can't say no, and then when they get to be a teenager and they don't say no to their social group, their peer pressure, they don't say no to the boy or the girl or the adult, and you wonder why. It's because you've told them no is a bad word.
Yeah.
Right.
So what it needs, the small children don't necessarily have people don't necessarily have the ability to explain, or the time in a situation to explain why they are saying no. So sometimes that's all you've got is that one word, no.
Yeah.
But an explanation, following that, of what it means, teaching the ability to say no because, and knowing when you are required to say because, and respecting when your kid says no.
Yeah.
This is a pet peeve.
No, it's important. It's important.
I have probably a slightly different experience than a lot of people parenting, because my son has a genetic syndrome, Coulin-de-Vries syndrome. So he's developmentally delayed. He's nonverbal, and it took him like years to learn to walk. But he talks with a augmentative communication device. So, and I've always thought that I was better prepared to be a mother of a child like that, because I was a fan of Lois McMaster Bujold and her Cordelia, who was the mom to special needs Miles.
Oh God.
Excuse me for 2 seconds.
So it's kind of an interesting thing, because I had to teach my son to sass me. I felt it was an important skill for a nonverbal person to have. I taught him to tell me to go away.
Speaking of children,
and sometimes he shocks other people.
That's an important thing for a kid to learn. Anybody who feels dependent on someone else, to the extent that children are dependent, should be able to say, I need to be without you right now. And have that, be able to say that and have it respected. I think one of the things that people find hardest to understand about children, either raising them or watching other people raise them, is that you start with a newborn, and you're supposed to, and this being changes. It gets older and it grows, it gains experience and is expected at
privacy
to become an adult. But it's supposed to become an adult human being who is held accountable. And there's a long space in there where you are responsible for making that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't seem to understand that that takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that you have to prepare. You can't just say, okay, you're 18, you should be able to make these decisions. Well, how come? Why should I be able to make these decisions?
Well, not suddenly, for sure.
Yeah, you have to start at the very beginning. You know, when there's an option, you say, okay, you're 2 years old, you're 3 years old, you want to dress yourself, take this one or this one. Make a choice.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And
one
then
thing,
decisions have to be respected. So don't offer your kid a decision that you cannot respect.
yeah. That's a good point. Actually, I wanted to take a little bit of a side trip here into some alternate cultural things, because I think it's important. When I was studying child development, and I was studying child language development in particular, you can see a bunch of studies that come from people who are studying a lot of, white American kids. And they come in with a lot of, hey, this is how kids development works and kids language development works. And one thing, you get a lot of studies of things like baby talk and the way that parents talk to children. And in fact, the way that parents talk to children varies quite a lot. And in some societies, parents don't talk to children. They're off doing their thing. And in fact, the kids are mostly learning their language skills from a sibling or from a slightly older peer group or things like that. So some of the expectations that we have about the relationships between parents and children simply do not hold across world cultures. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And also the kinds of expectations that we have for what kids are going to be capable of are very culturally influenced as well. The extended childhood dependency sort of thing is not the same, and it doesn't take the same form in every culture. I'm thinking specifically of some instances of very small children participating in First Nations celebrations in very sophisticated ways, for example.
Well, that's one of the things that we learn about, especially toddlers. Toddlers aren't stupid. They just haven't had a whole lot of experience.
Right.
And so I think people without children or people who haven't had a huge amount of childrearing experience think of them as not necessarily being little people, but they are already.
Mm-hmm.
And they're already themselves.
Yeah. I'm writing that down.
I've heard us talking about the age at which children are expected to go off on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And just a reminder that that's very culturally specific.
Mm-hmm.
And that it seems weird in a North American context to think that 13 is an adult, even though it is ceremonially in the cultures that we have around us.
Yeah.
Not just in Jewish cultures, but in some others. But there's a reason for that historically, and that as we're world building, understanding what the age of majority is, or the age of independent social inclusion is an important factor of how your culture is set up.
Yeah.
And also whether there are, I guess I don't know how much you wanted to bind it to just young children, Juliet, this topic, but.
No, I don't in particular.
Independence rituals, initiation rituals into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
I think as wild worlders, first worlders, whatever term you want to use, we forget that these were really important, and then actually there was an expectation that a certain percentage of kids would fail. And and what kinds of rates of mortality are you expecting for children? and that when you allow children to be more independent, you do increase risk, but you also increase the ability for a child to be a participating member as opposed to a necessarily dependent and weaker and needing protection. I just said that twice, but individual. So
There's also,
depending upon like where your future culture is assuming science fiction, you know, I can easily imagine that children would be tasked with crucial but less complex tasks at a younger age in a certain kind of environment.
Yeah.
what does independence really mean is part of this. If you're talking about a society where families live together, like, you know, more extended families live together, live closer together, the children take more of a role in caring for the household, then being an adult at 13 can mean something very different. You're not expected to go off and get a job and live on your own.
Yeah, you guys noticed that in Kiki's delivery service?
Oh yeah.
Off she goes, she's 13 years old, and she's gonna go to another town and get a job. And I was like, all right then, you know, look at
Okay, but then what about and I don't know enough, so this is actually a question, apprentices to
Yeah,
to craftsmen.
you could
At what
you could
age
go
and-
off. I mean, but you know, it's interesting because you could go off and be independent, but you could also be living like a block away from your parents.
right.
You know, it's not, you know, and same with like, you know, the village, if you live in a little village somewhere, you know, and you're 13 and you're an adult and you get a house next to your parents, you know, or something. And then, you know, but there are some times where like you were like if you were a girl, you might be shipped off to your husband's village
Right.
at 13.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of a toss up on what your situation is going to be and how far from home you're actually going to end up.
Well, actually, I wanted to bring up one thing that this has been making me think of, and that is that in Japan, kids are typically very good at getting around in their community at very young ages. And I don't know whether Kat would like to speak to that, but I was reading articles about it recently, which I could comment on.
One of the issues is that there is not the same perception of stranger danger.
Right.
And there isn't the same antagonistic relationship between the police and everybody else. And the public transit system is much more well developed, and also it's just denser so that children have eyes on them. So yes, children are expected to be able to go around and about more well. And you know, you can see the parallel in the US. Oh, I've just lost her name for a moment. The woman who started the whole anti-helicopter parenting movement, the free-range kids. And you know, she's in New York City, where she feels that her kid is capable of navigating the metro system, the transit system there, the trains. And here where I am, if I tried to put my kid on our public transit system without an adult, I think that the age at which I'm allowed to let my child be independent is like 14, which utterly enrages me. I have a convenience store 2 blocks away. I'd love to be able to just let my kid go get the milk that he wants.
Right.
Even though it's crossing a major lane of traffic, because there's a crosswalk, a light, you know, a crosswalk light there, and so he should be able to cross. So, and a lot of this is also about whether or not a car-centric culture. When we don't expect pedestrians, it makes it harder for children. When we don't expect a lot of children around, it makes it hard for children because you're not looking out at that head height.
Yeah.
So the entire reason children are able to be independent in Japan is a concerted cultural effort to make that possible.
Yeah. And I think that's it seemed related to what Morgan was saying, but a lot of what makes independence possible is a supportive community.
Right.
You know.
I also wanted to bring up, I have a story where I have gone back to the sort of European noble tradition of fostering your kids out to your neighbors and swapping kids around. That might have something to do with the fact that some days it's easier to have somebody else's kid than mine. But yeah, I think that as we're telling our stories, sometimes there's an inclination to assume that our own context is universal. Mm-hmm. So I'm also thinking about when I was talking specifically about when is a child considered an independent participant in society, I was not thinking so much only of living in an independent living space, but more when is their counsel in a group decision-making environment considered worth listening to? Mm-hmm. If you're talking about a more communal culture as opposed to a nuclear family separated culture. Mm-hmm. You know, when can children participate in the talk of grown-ups to decide what's going on with things?
Yeah.
When you get up from the kids' table.
Well, and then there's class issues as well. I've written historical fiction, Age of Sail kinds of things, and it's, you know, you could also translate that into science fiction and spaceships and things like that. But you know, you had the ship's boys were like 8 years old, and the midshipmen would be teenagers. But the midshipmen were, you know, they were ranked. You know, they had a rank. The forecastle guys, just the crew, could be bossed around by teenagers.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up, I mean, what I was thinking of earlier is there's a certain amount of sexism in, like, we expect women to be adults, but they're always sort of infantilized by the culture. Mm. So that's another part of that.
Less capable.
Uh-huh.
Or also seen as like the property of fathers, brothers, husbands.
Uh-huh. Yeah, genetic lines.
Yeah, the way that a woman can be insulted and say no, and that's a problem. But if she's with a guy, she won't be. It's kind of like even still. So,
yeah.
It's like, as long as she's the property of some man, she's hands off. But she's never the property of herself.
Right.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, and that's a whole other discussion, because then the insult leveled at a woman who's with a man are actually meant to be leveled at the man. But that's a whole different dive.
Yeah, that's a whole different dive. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Not the kid thing.
But I was actually going to say there's another wrinkle to this sexism thing, which is when we talk about men being children. Yes. Usually what it's meant to do is to create them as people who are deserving of women's care and labor. It doesn't actually take away their power in the public sphere, but in the private sphere, women are supposed to take care of them as though they can't take care of themselves.
But they're not supposed to relinquish their power in order to be cared for.
I want
that
to
is a power they have.
Yes, because
I want to interject that I hear all these things and I absorb them, and I observe them, and I acknowledge their reality. But I'm also, as I'm hearing this, thinking about the racialized dimension that takes it off into a different field.
Sure.
As a woman of color, I get treated differently when I have a white woman companion with me than when I have a male person of color companion, and whiteness trumps gender. So most safety for me is being with a white man who clearly treats me with respect. Least safe is being with other women of color, and there's colorism in there and other factors, but let's not, if we could try not to be reductive and just make it all about, oh, definitely men this way and then women this way and accompanying.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've got an elephant in your room, Brian.
Well, I think there's also, I mean,
creaking chair. Sorry.
When you're a kid, you have to learn to negotiate these systems too, right? I remember some of my early thoughts about gender were, I'm so glad I'm a girl because I can read all the books. But but I never received anything from my family or cultural background that ever kind of limited what I could plan to do with myself because I was a girl. But I know other people have.
And that is very different from some cultures where girls are not allowed to read, or not so much necessarily allowed to read, but not allowed to participate in school or be educated. So
Yeah.
if you wanted to be able to read, to be allowed to study and think and explore, you had to be a boy, you know, to use books.
Or they would have widely different tracks of education, like the girls finishing schools.
I think to take this back out of just looking at this from gender, I think it's possibly more useful in world building to look at this from just who is marginalized and who is not, and what
Right.
labels are those, because there's also marginalization by class, by caste, by sheer economics, and in the worlds we're creating, we can do all sorts of things, but knowing why and how is really important.
Mm-hmm.
That's
And
the
some
history
of
of
the
it.
things we received really mixed signals as a Black person and a woman. You know, at about 13, 14, you start looking at, you know, dating and that sort of thing, and the message I got from my culture was, "We want you to reproduce. We don't want more of you, but that's your job as a woman." So how do you, you know, and you can't get contraception, but you're supposed to, and like all of these conflicting messages that you have to figure your way through, and you know, at a fairly young age.
Yeah. Yeah, well, certainly as you get up into that borderline between childhood and adulthood, wherever that should happen to fall, things get very, very complicated. And that, you know, we could talk about that for an hour. Quite easily, I imagine.
We could, and even as a younger child, you get to watch your older sisters deal with it.
Right.
Or your older brothers, and how their different treatment is, and then you wonder how yours is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, this brings me to something. You guys, we've all heard of the idea of the talk. And
Sex education.
There's always going to be the talk, but the talk is going to be, there could be several of them, or there could be different ones depending on which culture you're a part of. You know, like there are these things that everybody needs to know, and that are potentially very difficult or dangerous. And one of the things that I ended up running into in the story that I'm working on is my protagonist ends up having to have the talk with her daughter about death. And it kind of took me by surprise. And at the same time, I felt like, oh, well, this is a thing that parents do. Sometimes, you know, sometimes you don't have to have the talk. Sometimes it's something where, well, you know, it's been so normal this entire time that we didn't talk about it, but it was just built into the way that we live our lives. But at the same time, it's worth asking, you know, what do parents have dire talks with their children about, and when? You know,
Right. And
whether that be
if you,
death or sexuality or anything like that. Sorry, Kat.
we have an assumption in the West now that families will live in such generational segregation that children aren't exposed to death from an early time. And we also have gotten away from agrarian roots in other places where children are encountering more death. And so, you know, a white suburban child in North America is mostly encountering death because their hamster died or their fish died, and it's a very different experience
Right.
than people dying. And it's especially in environments with a blend of religions and beliefs and cultures. Yes, parents need to have the talk in ways that it wasn't necessary about death before. But this is also, we are just talking about childhood, but there's an entire question about how your world deals with death and birth and child rearing and mating and do they couple or not and everything else. So I guess the question I have fundamentally that I hope is already being asked is, how much are you modeling on what you know and assuming that it's normal?
Mm-hmm.
I was just reading, I've just finally started reading Chip Delaney's short fiction, and I'm reading The Star Pit, and I'm only partway through it, but I'm looking and noticing that he's got parenting and child rearing and childhood written very differently than any sort of standard norms expected among science fiction readers, whether we're talking about readers in China or Europe or the Americas. I don't know what other traditions he might be drawing from in order to come up with this world, but it definitely highlights the not now here Americanness of his story.
Yeah.
Well, then that's, I mean, it's one thing to, of course, build a, you know, an alternate world with human characters, but then also the alien characters. People often base them off of different kinds of animal species and their types of gestation and nurturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could. Almost there's like there was at least it was in, I was watching this thing about zoos, and there was this one species of bird who from I think New Zealand, and unlike other birds, the parents just laid the egg and walked away.
Cuckoos.
And the bird was just born knowing everything it needed to survive, and that's somewhat unusual for birds to do that. You see that more in reptiles and things, and I thought that was kind of interesting. So there could just be like, you know, you may not even have to raise, you know, there could be aliens who don't have to raise children.
Yeah, that's a big split in bird behavior, actually, is altricial, and I can't remember the other name. But yeah, being born able to fend for yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Also, species undergo metamorphosis. I mean, you think about caterpillars to butterflies. Like the butterflies don't tend the caterpillars at all. They don't have any relationship with them whatsoever. It's two completely separate life cycles in that sense.
Yeah, like you may not even be part of the culture or intelligent until you metamorphose.
Possibly, yeah.
And then you're like, you're new. We will show you our culture or something. You know, I don't know.
Or the other way around. You may be intelligent at the larval stage, and the adult stage actually doesn't need to be intelligent. I think of things like sea squirts absorb their own brain when they become sessile.
Wow.
Chaz Brenchley actually has stories about Mars, at their steampunk Mars stories, and the Martian species in those stories is actually differentially intelligent at different life stages, and only I think one of the intermediate forms is actually vaguely intelligible to the humans who are trying to interact with them. But once they get to the adult form, you're like, we have no clue.
Done.
We're done. They're like they've passed through this zone where we are, I guess, ideally proximal to their mode of intelligence, and then well, not anymore. Anyway, well, so we're at the end of the hour. There's so much more here. Let's discuss at some point coming back to this, and I think it would be good to have some particular focal guidelines at that point. Because honestly, when we first start getting into a topic, we kind of range all over the place. But there are about 20 different places where I've put a little star in my notes going, this is a whole separate topic. This is a whole separate topic. So you know, absolutely, that's worth doing sometime in the future. What I wanted to let you know, my goodness, it's already the 3rd, which means the next week we have, is it next week? Wait a second. Yes, it is. Next week we have, hang on. I need to make sure. Hang on 2 seconds. Let me make sure because I don't want to get this wrong. I have a guest coming. Yay, guests. Okay. May the 17th, we're gonna have we're gonna meet at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, with author Don Chu to talk about his work. So
who? Oh, okay.
He has a story out right now in Uncanny Magazine, which is very interesting, and you should go read it. And so he's going to be here, but that he is what they call a working person who has a day job, and so we're going to be meeting at a little bit of a later time for him. It will be 5 p.m. Pacific and 8 p.m. Eastern. Hopefully, some of you will be able to make it.
That's also on Wednesday.
That is also a Wednesday, but it's not. But it's not next week. It's the week after.
I may be not able to make it. I'll be gone.
You know what? Everybody's a little different in their schedule, and
what are we discussing next week?
Next week, what are we talking about? I think that we were going to talk about city animals.
Ooh,
right.
Cool.
Juliet, can you put the title and source of that story in the chat bar, please?
Yes. Let me actually.
Things are just going through my head.
Story. Let me find it right now,
Thank you.
so that you guys can check.
It might be nice to be prepared for once.
Oh, yay! Well, you
I
know.
feel bad because I
This story
read current books. I can't afford books anymore, really.
Yeah, this story is called "Making the Magic Lightning Strike Me," which is a very, very interesting story. And let me see. I think he's had another story that you might. There we go.
Okay, I gotta get back to work. You guys have a good time.
Okay, great. So he also
Good to see
wrote
you.
The Water That Falls on You from Nowhere,
Ah, right.
which was at Tor.com, and I believe won an award.
Did.
Yes, it did. So definitely worth checking out, and he will be on the show on the 17th. And next week we'll talk about city animals.
Awesome.
All right.
Great.
Juliet, we were going to talk.
So thank you all for being here. Yeah.
We were going to talk sometime. Did you want to schedule that?
Sure. Let me stop the broadcast, and then we will make a time. All right. Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks for participating.